Hello, and welcome to Coffee with Jesus. I am your host, Todd Jubilee. Folks, this is going to be a two-part episode. In this first part, I'm going to give a very long introduction, and then I'm going to share about how God is in control. And I'm also going to share an experience from when I was in Afghanistan. Those of you who have been listening for a while may have heard this before, and I hope you'll bear with me as I share it again. For those of you who are new listeners, this may be the first time you're hearing it. Either way, I hope that you are blessed and comforted by this episode, and I hope you'll tune in again for the second part. So, with that being said, I know that there is a lot of anxiety right now with current events in our world today. It seems like the world is on fire. We have the war in Ukraine, where Russia has invaded Ukraine and is intentionally targeting civilians, and that has caused ripples throughout the entire global economy. And then on October 7th, Hamas launched a massive terrorist attack against the nation of Israel. For the first time in 50 years, Israel officially and formally declared war. At this point, we know that Iran is behind the Hamas attack, and another one of Iran's proxies, Hezbollah, is also attacking Israel from Lebanon and Syria. We know that Iran is trying to spread the current conflict in Gaza and make it a regional conflict, where Israel is completely and totally surrounded. Iran is trying to expand the war. There are also some indications that Russia is trying to expand the war in Europe. An event that was overshadowed by the news in Israel. The Baltic Connector. It is an oil pipeline that connects Finland and Estonia, two NATO countries. That pipeline was sabotaged. They determined that it was deliberate sabotage, and they are conducting an investigation to see what nation was responsible. At the time that this episode is being recorded, indicators point to Russia, although the investigation is still ongoing. Also, the small nations of Armenia and Azerbaijan are on the verge of war. Azerbaijan is poised to invade Armenia. They're ready to go. By the time that this episode is released, they may have already done so. If not, it's very likely that soon after the episode is released, they will. And then there's also the looming threat of China and Taiwan. Folks, it seems like our world is on fire right now, with wars erupting all over the place. And I know firsthand how much anxiety that can cause. For those of you who've been listening for a while, you know that I have spent 2 years in Afghanistan. I deployed with the Army, and then I turned around and went right back working for the Army as a civilian. For those of you who are new, I have actually shared some stories and some experiences from my time in Afghanistan on this show to illustrate God's providence, His protection, His comfort. And as we get into this episode, I'm going to share a little more. I may rehash some of the old stories, so those of you who've been listening for a while, I do apologize if it seems like I'm repeating myself. For those of you who are relatively new listeners, you'll be hearing it for the first time. But I will also be sharing some new stories. And folks, I'm going to just be honest with you and up front. I think there's some things I'm just not ready to share yet. So I hope that y'all will bear with me. I'll share as needed and as God leads me. But I know that the current state of the world and just the various wars that are happening, and even the very concept of war, is very anxiety inducing. And so what I would like to do in this episode is to share a few ways that we as Christians can respond a few ways that we as Christians can deal with the multiple wars that are raging on our planet right now. And if sharing some of my own stories can help alleviate some of that anxiety and can bring you some comfort, then I'm happy to do so. I will also be sharing scriptures to illustrate each of the points that I wish to make. And so I hope that when this episode is finished, feel less anxiety, that you will be equipped with the tools to react and to handle and to deal with just all the emotions that surround the wars that are going on. War is not like it is in the movies, folks. And I know that most of you who are listening understand this. You know, when I was in Afghanistan, I came across two different types of people. There were those who were, I'll call them braggarts. You know, they would boast and share wild stories, and I did this, and we were in this battle, and I took out all these enemies, and I did all these wonderful, great things. And then there were the quiet ones. They just kind of had this kind of faraway look. They didn't talk about much. They certainly didn't brag about anything. Folks, it's that second group that you knew had experienced some really, really hard stuff. The braggarts, I usually just kind of smiled and nodded, but the quiet ones, those were the ones that I usually tried to engage and talk to. Because there are a lot of good lessons learned, you know. War is not fun. It's not glorious. I'm going to be honest, folks, and I hope that you'll pardon me saying this, but war is scary as hell. It's not like the movies, it's not like the video games. It's terrifying. And I'm not afraid to admit that. I'm really not, because war is terrifying. And what we're seeing in these wars now is even more terrifying, because it's not soldiers versus soldiers. It's not, support personnel who are with the soldiers. Folks, when Russia first invaded Ukraine, they were intentionally targeting civilians. And I took a lot of flack at first for pointing this out. But it was true. And eventually, the media were reporting the very same thing. Russia was intentionally targeting hospitals and civilian apartment buildings, in some cases schools. When Hamas launched their unprecedented terror attack against Israel, they intentionally targeted civilians. The barbaric acts of murder that they committed, they're unspeakable. Folks, I'm going to be honest, just recording this episode, it's very difficult, because the very things that Hamas did, they are horrible and unspeakable. It was so horrendous, it's hard to even talk about. And folks, war is horrible. War is absolutely horrible and terrifying. I lay this all out up front because I don't want you all to think that I'm trying to be a fearmonger or a warmonger when I tell you that I fear things are going to get even worse before they get better. I do think that we are going to see the Middle East conflict and the European conflict expand, both of them. And I do think we'll see conflict in Asia as well. I am no global security expert, but I watch the news, I talk to friends, I talk to people who are closer to what's going on than I am, and I just feel like things are going to get worse before they get better. And so that's why I want to do this episode. I want to do this episode because there are very real, very practical steps that we as Christians can take in order to relieve some of the anxiety associated with war and with world events. First and foremost, folks, please understand and please know that God is in control. And I know that this sounds kind of cliche, one of those feel-good Christianese things that we tell each other. But folks, God really is in control. No matter how much of the world is on fire, no matter how many wars, no matter whether it's a very specific or regional or global event, ladies and gentlemen, God is in control. We had released a very short special episode soon after the Hamas terror attack in Israel. And in that episode, I shared very, very briefly about a particular time when I was in Afghanistan to illustrate how God is in control no matter what the circumstances. And what I would like to do right now is to try to expand on that a little bit. I would like to share the full story, and I've shared bits and pieces of this in prior episodes. And again, I went into it very briefly in that special episode, which we called God is in Control. I'd like to share the full story now to illustrate for you that God really is in control no matter what is going on around us. I had landed in a very small, very remote forward operating base, or FOB. I'd gone to breakfast, and I had just gotten to the temporary quarters that I was going to be staying at. This was basically half of a shipping container. We called them a CHU, containerized housing unit. And so I had just dropped my bag and had pulled off my armor, and I had just sat down in a chair when all of a sudden there was this loud ba-boom! Folks, it was so loud, and it shook the CHU so badly it literally knocked the heater right off the wall. I immediately hit the deck. And, my first thought was that a mortar or a rocket had landed right outside. The way things were set up, there's a whole row of these containerized housing units, or CHUs, next to each other. And the one that I was staying at was on the very end. And the blast was so intense, the noise so loud, the concussive wave so intense, I literally thought a mortar or rocket had landed right outside my CHU. And then my second thought was, well, why am I not dead? Why am I still alive? Because had that been the case, the shrapnel would have torn through that thin container wall very easily. As things turned out, which I found out later, the explosion was about 400 meters away. That's roughly 1.5 football fields away. But this explosion was so large and so intense that it damaged buildings a full kilometer from the blast site. I was lying on the floor, my mind racing. It seemed like hours, but really it was just a minute or two at most. I opened my door and kind of peeked my head out, and one of my buddies down a few opened his door and he peeked his head out, and we kind of acknowledged each other and checked on each other, made sure that we were each okay. And then I told him to go ahead and get his armor and get into the bunker, and then he told me to do the same thing. What had happened was a group of Taliban had loaded up a truck with 1,500 pounds of high explosive. They then drove this truck up to the wall of the base and set off the explosives. This was so powerful, it blew a hole in the wall. It damaged vehicles hundreds of meters away. Damaged buildings up to a full kilometer away. My CHU, the heater, was knocked right off the wall from the blast. On the other side of the row, some of the walls were actually pushed in from the concussion wave from the blast. After the explosion, 9 Taliban individuals tried to enter our base. Our base had its own quick reaction force and very quickly and easily took care of the invaders. Folks, that explosion was powerful. That explosion was intense. And then after that explosion, 9 of our enemy tried to come onto that base and kill every single person on that base. But they were thwarted. They were stopped. There was no injuries and no deaths on our side. I share this story because for some of you, it feels like the war in the Middle East and the war in Europe are right next door. It feels like they're right outside your chew, and the damage is vast. The damage is far reaching. The damage from these wars has global impact and on our security, on our food supplies, on our economies. You name it, the impacts are far reaching, vast, and run deep. But folks, God took care of me in Afghanistan. God was in control of the entire situation. I could not see everything that happened. Now, after the fact, I was able to see video. I was able to do an investigation. I was able to look at surveillance. But while it was actually happening, I had no idea what was going on. I put on my armor and I went to the bunker while the brave soldiers whose job it was to react to this incursion did so and did their job very well. But I had no idea what was going on. But God did. God was in control. God was in control when I was on that fob in Afghanistan. And ladies and gentlemen, God is in control right now. I know it seems odd, and a loving God who cares so much about us could allow such horrible, horrible atrocities to happen. Folks, there is a deep-rooted evil in this world. And I'm going to just come out and say it. Hamas is evil. What they did is evil. Their goal is to murder every single Jew in the Middle East. That is evil. When I was in Afghanistan, the Taliban wanted to murder every single person on that base. But God stopped them because God was in control. Folks, even with the wars raging all over our planet, God is in control. And the first step, I think, for us as Christians, as human beings, is to understand that God is in control and that God will take care of us. God took care of me in Afghanistan through this particular event and through so many others. God is with you. God will comfort you. God will carry you through. Remember, no matter what you see on the news, God is in control. I know we're living in some scary time, folks, and I'm going to be honest with you. I've been feeling some anxiety myself every time I read the news and I see what's happening. But I stop, I take a deep breath, and I tell myself that God is in control. And I know I have said those words many, many times so far in this podcast. But honestly, folks, that's how I comfort myself, is reminding myself that God is in control. God has taken care of me through so much. The very, very first episode of Season 4, I called it How to Recover from Rock Bottom Part 3. I shared when there were just so many things happening at once, and how I was once again at rock bottom, and how God saved me from that. God will save you too. Psalm 27:1 tells us, "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid?" And Psalm 121 verses 1 and 2, "I lift up my eyes to the hills. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth." And finally, Psalm 18. And folks, I encourage you to read the entire chapter. This is a great chapter. This is a great psalm. I'm going to read verse 6, and then I will skip down to verses 16 and 17. "In my distress, I called to the Lord. I cried to my God for help. From his temple, he heard my voice. My cry came before him into his ears." And skipping down, "He reached down from on high and took hold of me. He drew me out of deep waters. He rescued me from my powerful enemy, from my foes who were too strong for me. Ladies and gentlemen, God is more powerful than anything on the face of the earth. And that's not just hyperbole. God created the earth. God created the entire universe. He literally spoke it into existence. He is more powerful than anything that you are facing. And if you cry out to Him, He will hear your cry and He will provide you with the help that you need. I know the world is a scary place right now. There are a lot of really scary things going on, and there are probably more scary things that are going to be happening in the not too distant future. But through it all, God is in control. And if we can focus on that and hold on to that thought, that can bring you such great comfort. And folks, when you are feeling overwhelmed, when the anxiety just threatens to consume you, cry out to God. Call out to your Father in heaven, and He will hear your cry, and He will give you the peace and the comfort that you need. He will give you the strength to make it through each and every day. Folks, God's got you. I've told you before, you matter. You matter. God's got you. God is in control. Ladies and gentlemen, regardless of what is happening in the world today, God's got you. God will comfort you. God will give you the strength you need to face the day. God will help you with whatever you need. God is in control. As always, thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And may God bless each and every one of you.